Welcome, welcome, welcome. At this time, we ask everybody please put the phone on silent or vibrate so we can give our speaker full, undivided attention. Today, we have a special guest. We have Mr. Mike Wagner. He is a senior engineer with Zscaler. Today, Mike is going to be talking about network segmentation lessons from the animal kingdom. He has over 8 years of experience in engineering and product management, focusing on micro-segmentation and zero-trust architecture in his free time. He enjoys playing music, gardening, and mountain biking. Everybody, please give him a hand.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Welcome, welcome. Hopefully, everybody got a chance to fill their bellies on some good lunch, a little pasta, managed to get strayed away from the pack and found yourselves all the way down this dark corridor into probably what's going to be one of the more eclectic presentations today. So again, my name is Mike Wagner. I'm a sales engineer with Zscaler. I've been in the industry for several years. Have the unique opportunity today to present to you. Attended HUSETCon since a very inaugural conference, and this is going to be my first time up to bat actually presenting here. So hopefully it's a good session. The topic today is going to be network segmentation lessons that we can learn from the animal kingdom. Before we get started, really, to kind of center in on a theme and the focus for today, it's really around this concept of biomimicry. And this is nothing new, especially when we look at engineering and how humankind has solved problems that we've encountered in a wide variety of domains and industries by looking at the animal kingdom and studying and analyzing and identifying ways and lessons and means by which we can improve upon our own attempts at creating things and optimizing, advancing the race forward, right? So kind of a classic example is when we look at the B-2 bomber, some of the inspiration derived from a peregrine falcon at max speed. As we can see the hawk nose of the aircraft. But today we're going to be focusing in on 3 specific use cases to understand how we can better segment our networks, what kind of lessons we can learn from these use cases. Before we get into those, just a little bit about me. So again, I've been in the industry for coming up on, knocking on the door of a decade. Been in a variety of functional roles, but really been heavily focused on security within the industry for about 8 or 9 years. Had my hands in product management as well, so had a really key understanding of how to liaison customer requests and needs and objectives they're looking to solve and how we can better build that into the products that we're delivering. And on the back end of this, where this kind of this collusion between tech and the animal world exists is obviously I'm a big nerd. I've loved the animal kingdom since I was a little kid. That has now gotten me to the point, and luckily I have a wife who is on board with this, but we have a small petting zoo at our house. I've got 5 dogs, a cat, a goat, and many more on the way apparently if you ask my daughter. So today what we're going to be discussing is going to be focusing on 3 use cases. So we're going to be taking a look at bees in respect to their hives. We're going to be looking at ants in respect to their colonies. And we're also going to be looking at prairie dogs in respect to their towns. Now, obviously, each of these individual species is their own unique element, but there's some very shared common characteristics in the way that they set up a defensible architecture with their particular living spaces. And the idea here is, you know, when we look at these use cases, the animal kingdom affords us something that we don't necessarily have in our environments today, right? We've got generations of iterations here, right? These species have been working on these designs and been optimizing their colonies and their homes for thousands of years or more, right? Multiple generations of iterations. So they're able to take those lessons and relay that on to the next generation. They're very core resource focused. So similarly, when we look at networks as underlying transport for really connecting our users and non-user devices to the applications and resources that they need to reach, the idea here is, as a business and as a technical team tasked with the responsibility of protecting those, we need to keep that core resource focus in mind, right? If we lose the core apps and core resources that run the business, we jeopardize either revenue availability, we jeopardize the business's existence itself, or we jeopardize safety of operations, right? Especially looking at ICS, OT networks, there's a very strong correlation between those. And then also the reason that we're focusing on these use cases as well today is the boundary of their scale, right? When we actually look at these individual species, and I'll drop some metrics here in a bit, but immense scale when we look at the size of these networks that they're utilizing to communicate their messages and signals to each other in order to ultimately gain their core objectives. And when we look at this super secret formula at the bottom of this slide, it's ultimately a combination of being able to attack and defend. Now, obviously in cybersecurity, we can't necessarily go down the road of attacking back the attackers, right? But we can attack the kill chain, right? And the idea is we can become much more defensible, have a much higher defense posture to eliminate ability for threats to move laterally within our networks and get to more core business applications. We can bolster our defenses. We can optimize the applications and the workloads and the workflows and processes that are running behind all of those. And then the outcome, right, is gonna be key positive goal outcomes where we're gonna have, in the case of the animal kingdom, they're looking at surpluses, whether that's food, whether that's population, as well as the ability to have that resiliency, right? When we look at that ability for that animal kingdom and that particular species to continue to thrive and bring on that next generation. Same thing when we look at our networks and we look at these phases as we go from generation to network, as we adapt in the industry and the way things are built. We need to have these lessons that we learn continue to build as we move through. Now, a couple key items here before we get into this, right? Bold statement, right? This might be a hot take, but my position is network segmentation is never going to be perfect. And I think when we look at these use cases, we'll identify that in their particular instances, they also recognize there is no point in striving for a perfect position. And even if you attain that perfect position, right, it's only momentary before another external factor happens to pop into the equation. Now you've got to adapt, be able to ensure that at the end of the day, your core resources, the things that you're driving towards protecting are there, right? But the key here is when we look at not striving for perfection, instead recognizing that we're going to face unknowns. Instead, we need to be more positioned to be adaptable. We need to have the agility to move when things change, especially behavioral-based aspects change for the devices and assets within our network. We need to have a mastery over the protocols that are being leveraged in our network, right? And when we look at these use cases, we'll align to what protocols and what they're leveraging for their communication and the ways they protect that. But the idea here is if we don't even have visibility into the protocols and port groups that are being leveraged, what kind of communication relationships exist within these networks, we're at a very huge disadvantage from being able to do anything about it, right? So initially that first step, if you find yourself in a position, especially brownfield environments, right, where we're trying to retrofit security into an environment that never had security by design as a principle when it was built. See this a lot, obviously, in legacy environments, a lot of OT shop floors where there's this notion of embedding security as they're re-architecting. The idea here is we've got to master and get that full visibility and command and control over all of that traffic flow that's taking place in the network. And then the last point here as well is it's essential that you recognize we're in this in a team effort, right? So it's very essential that you know your role and know the plan, right? Especially when we face uncertainties and we have to move from our normal business day operations into a defensive posture, maybe something containment based because something could be signaling that there's an event, much less an indicator of compromise that we now need to adapt to prevent the spread of lateral threats within our environment. So we'll distill this down when we think of this, right? So network segmentation ultimately is eliminating the ability of lateral threat movement within our environment, gaining that full visibility and control over east, west, and north-south traffic, reducing the operational complexity associated with that, right? Because I can tell you in most of the engagements that I've worked on supporting customers, not a single one of them has come to the table without a sense of pain about some kind of previous attempt or journey with segmentation, right? It's typically a tall task and there's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of dependencies. So when you're analyzing and you're coming up with this strategy for a successful network segmentation approach, it's very key that you understand the consideration of reducing that operational friction and complexity, that administrative burden, so the team and the resources you have allocated internally can focus more on those core business projects that carry the business actually forward, right? So there's these aspects here where we're speaking to security, we're speaking to efficiency, and then lastly, looking at resiliency, that ability to have continuous validation, right? To where we're embracing the zero trust mindset and this principle of not only authenticating, but also continuously validating as we authorize those particular users within our network to access those various applications and resources. Now, some key benefits come from this as well when you actually get into a defensible architecture with proper network segmentation, especially when we look at that day 2 experience of the unknowns and realizing that adversaries are good adversary, right? They're going to come up with the 0-day tomorrow that you and I sat and we created all the policies and rule sets, all the access control lists under the sun we could possibly think of. That adversary's going to come up with something tomorrow that we did not prepare for. So then what? How do we have our networks and our security stack tuned to be able to identify when behaviorally things are deviating from those baselines, and then being able to have a much more surgical incident response plan now that we have things segmented or even ideally micro-segmented? We no longer have to go through that traditional exercise if we think something is compromised, that we're starting to unplug wires, we're shutting down VLANs, which again is going to have a direct correlation to affecting production, affecting business application availability, right? So when we get into this notion, we actually get into a much more creative way in which we can define our response plans, and we'll see that in these use cases as we move through this. And ultimately, as we look at zero trust principles, the idea is this whole traditional network infrastructure, this idea of castle moat, right? We're moving to a position where we abstract the users and the resources from that network, and now we can consider the network itself more just transport. It's merely an underlay there to provide the path. All right, so diving in to our very first use case, let's talk bees. So bees are a keystone species. As you may know, bees are invaluable to multiple ecological systems in the world. And in terms of scale, when we look at bees, right, there's hundreds of different species. They're globally distributed. And there's some amazing things in terms of expertise that bees have, right? They're fantastic when it comes to workload segmentation, equipping microservices, and of course we all are probably familiar with their ability for collective defense in depth, right? This kind of massive collective DDoS, if you will, against any of their attackers, things that are threatening their hive. And then when we look at kind of the verticals and these industries that they touch, right? We're looking at an all-in-one cohesive unit, something like a content delivery network that's mixed with a telco. We've got hospitals where we've got maternity wards. We've got food and bev manufacturing, right? So there's a host of applications and workloads that bees are focused on. And we'll dive into how they structure their networks, how they structure their hives that ultimately leverage segmentation to drive each of these to their objective. Last piece too, when we get into this, bees are also the most amazing cloud migration champs, especially when you think of the swarming concept, and we'll get into what that means and how they address business continuity and disaster recovery. All right, so let's break down this whole process with bees. So first and foremost, we need to think of, just like we have various privileges and various users within our environment, bees have different role types as well, right? So you've got your foragers, you've got the ones that are out there gathering the food, whether it's the pollen and the nectar, they're bringing it back to the hive, right? They're searching, they're scouting out new food sources. When they bring that to the hive, there's receiver bees that collect the food and the nutrients from those bees, and then they move it into processing, right? So think of the data that they're processing, and they're storing it in either honey databases, right, or brood databases that they're building out. So there's segmentation within the workloads themselves and how they're processing this. I actually had the unique opportunity several years ago to tour a very large bee farm operation. I got to don the bee suit, do the whole 9 yards, and walk through this. And I was having a casual conversation with the beekeeper as I was standing there. We had the hives all around us. We're out in a field. And as I'm standing there, I start to hear this louder buzz, right? And it's becoming this cacophony of buzzing that's around us. And the beekeeper said, wait a minute, you're standing in their tunnel. And I'm thinking, I'm in the middle of their SD-WAN tunnel. I've got to get out of this. And as soon as I move out of the way, like the bees that are all scattered around us all consolidate into a nice form and get into that hive, right? So there's this constant, this foraging that takes place. And bees, typically when you look at just the production alone, it takes, I think they've calculated about 10 million flowers to produce about 2 liters of honey. So you can imagine the process by which you have all these different entities and endpoints and assets that are out there collecting this data and bringing it back to that centralized facility, right? And that hive itself, that is the data center where all the precious food, all that data is stored. there's a continuous validation process, and the way that bees actually leverage their messaging is through pheromones. Our next use case is going to use the same kind of messaging framework as well, but these pheromones are highly detailed and in depth, and the idea is these bees are centrally controlled by the queen, right? The queen is really the CISO, the CIO of the organization. She's the one that's driving everything forward for the security team. And based on the role types, right, there's different pheromones that the queen releases, that the other bees release, that all communicate to each other to let them know, hey, this is actually a more optimized path to this food source, or hey, there's a potential threat that's coming towards the hive, or we have a threat inside of the hive, right? And all of these signals and indicators, you can look at them as ways that they form their packet. What kind of payload do they have in there? What kind of flags are they setting to alert the rest of the network that something needs to be addressed? Right, and so it's fascinating when you look at this, right? When we look at even down to the hive design itself, there's this amazing process that bees use called bee chaining or festooning, where they literally link their bodies together to measure out distances within the hive to decide, hey, this is the proper distance we need from this particular set of cells to this set of cells, whether those are brood cells, and maintaining the difference and the distance from those, from their honey and food production cells. And it all goes into these ideas, especially when we think of extrapolating that to how we would build out a data center in the architecture of where we need to measure not only optimal performance, but also the climate control, thinking of aspects of keeping a constant temperature despite what the external temperature is affording us, right? So there's this amazing aspect that these insects have into architecting and building these networks. Even more so when we get into the actual workloads themselves, when we look at the role type of a bee that's a nurse bee, they're running checksums on the broods themselves, right? And the idea is they're looking for data corruption, or in this case, they're looking for veromites, which happens to be a parasite that loves to piggyback right on bees, infest a whole colony, and cause ultimate hive collapse if those mites get out of control. These bees are intuitive enough that they can actually, within their specific role, they're doing deep packet inspection within that cell. They can identify if that larva is infected with a mite, and they'll neutralize that larva. Obviously, it's a bit of an infanticide, right? If I said that right. But the idea is it's preventing the overall collapse of the entire network. So this is something when we look back at how would we learn lessons from this when we establish our network? Well, it's important to have a highly integrated security stack. I don't just want to have certain things that are monitoring the perimeter. I need to have monitoring. I need to have sensors that are within the environment, whether those are on the endpoints and the assets themselves, like these nurse bees that are inspecting these cells, or if they're staged at different areas within the network. Maybe we have a distributed firewall approach. Maybe we're leveraging something more of a modern approach where we're leveraging like /32 concepts to totally ring fence devices into a network of one and tightly control the traffic between those. The idea is these bees are leveraging this. Now taking this further, right, before we wrap up bees and move on to the next, one fascinating thing I came across, there's a particular pheromone that the queen constantly emits. It's called the queen mandibular pheromone, or QMP. Very much like SNMP, right? It's just a constant measure for the rest of the hive to know that the queen's health is good, that things are in a proper state, and the levels of that QMP drive actions for the hive, which is fascinating, right? So if the QMP levels are too low, the hive the rest of the bees get a sense that there's too much congestion. We're reaching a level of capacity within our network, and we need to drive and do something completely radical, which is where they go into this next step, and they go into a swarm, right? And this whole idea is, typically it's associated once a brand new queen is born, the queens duel it out, they have this fight. Whoever loses, you got to get out of here, take half the team with you. You guys are going to go spin up a brand new data center, right? And the idea is they're literally doing this OG cloud migration move where they're going from that hive, they're going out into the unknown. They don't even have a site picked out, right? So there's a limited time frame. They're already under the gun. And this is very similar when we think of business continuity, disaster recovery scenarios where we've got to pivot and we've got to flip over to that secondary site because our initial site is down. If we've done our constant verification, we validated our backups are going to work, we can recover, we can model ourselves after how these bees handle these situations where not only from capacity concerns, but maybe threats where they need to migrate and move to a new location. So it's a fantastic case study. I think it's worthy of its own presentation alone, just the swarming mechanism itself. But end to end, when we look at the life cycle and the way that bees manage their networks, right, there's this notion of securing data at rest, data at motion, being able to alert to known threats, things that may appear that could be adversaries. And just like us, they've got APT groups, right? Fascinating how many different animals consume bees, right? And as I went through this study, whether it was bees or ants or prairie dogs, for the exception of prairie dogs, there's literally an animal for bees and ants that's called the bee eater or the ant eater, right? That's what they're known for. Now, one that I wanted to focus in on here when we think of advanced persistent threats and some of the ways that they're able to evade bee detection and actually get into the hive and do damage is this death-head hawk moth. Now, some of you may recognize this, right, from some pop culture references. When we look at the Silence of the Lambs, that's the death-head hawk moth. This particular moth is fascinating, incredibly on its own right. It actually begins this migration from northern Africa and flies thousands of miles all the way to Europe. And scientists are studying this moth and looking at ways they can optimize paths based on the way that it leverages the magnetism of the earth and the ability to identify cardinal directions and get to locations. But this hawk moth does something very, very interesting. It's actually able, and we can see this picture here where it's right at the entrance of the hive. We notice there's no bees that are attacking it. None of them are concerned. This hawk moth will actually traipse its way all the way into the hive, walk right up to a honey cell and start. It's got a long proboscis where it allows it to reach that honey, get through the wax and get down in there, take some sips, drink, fill its belly, and then it just walks right out. And the whole time, none of the bees are alerting to it. Well, scientists studied this and they realized that the death-head hawk moth actually has fatty acids from honeybees in its body. So what it's doing is it's obfuscating, right? It's evading detection because the smell that it gives off is what the other bees smell like. So they don't even notice it, right? So when we think of this in our own environments, right, think of DNS tunneling, right, where you've got adversaries that are going to try to hide malicious payloads within trusted traffic, right? And so this is where, when we think of segmentation, we don't necessarily want to embrace just network monitoring tools, especially just passive monitoring tools, where we may only be getting partial packet flow through that and being able to analyze. We see a lot more of these features where these adversaries are leveraging evading detection and obfuscation. So a fantastic just study there. Again, network segmentation is never perfect, right? They've got threat actors that have figured out ways around their defenses, but at the end of the day, bees are still here. Probably the biggest threat actor we have is us, right? So as we move through this, let's see what else we can uncover. That brings us to ants. Okay, so ants, fascinating. These guys, just to give you some numbers in terms of scale. So there's an estimated 20 quadrillion ants in the world. They outnumber humans 2.5 million to 1. And there's over 12,000 individual ant species that have some wildly different ways in the way that they build not only their nests and their networks, but also the way that they operate, what they eat, the way that they go to war, right? We actually have measured that ants launch war campaigns against other ant colonies. And ants have been studied extensively for the ways that we can adapt lessons from them. There's literally an algorithm already created that's been patented called the ant colony optimization algorithm. And it's been leveraged in a lot of industries. Many delivery organizations use ACO to improve their routes from stop to stop. Because the way that this works is ants, when they go out and they're foraging, right, they're using pheromones just like bees. So it's a chemical messaging, right, that they're emulating. These resonate in the air. So as they emit this pheromone happens to stay in that particular aerosolized environment, right? And as ants encounter it, it tells them things, right? And one of the things that they are always telling each other is, hey, this is the quickest path to food, right? And as that changes, these other ants that take that fork in the road, they take the fork that's less traveled and find, hey, this is actually a quicker path to that food. They start advertising that. What ends up happening is the old route gets decommissioned and now the other ants take the fastest route. So it's this ability to take this concept that ants have employed within their foraging and in their workload production and actually taking virtual ants, right? And whether that's placing them throughout routes within a city or if it's in a content delivery network to ensure that media gets to its users in a faster amount of time. This ant colony optimization algorithm is an excellent framework and is being utilized a lot. Think Waze, right, where you're gonna have the shortest path advertisement. Think policy-based routing, where it's gonna let them know, hey, look, this is a much quicker path. There's less degradation, there's less rocks, there's less things in the way for us to climb. Another fascinating thing about ants is they use a whole host of different means and methods by which they set up their networks, right? And this differentiates kind of geographically. So when we look at Mexican ants, for example, they use a hub and smoke model, right? So there's very much like big food distributors, they'll have these large distribution colonies, and then they'll have these various spokes and paths that all fork back to a central nest, and it helps the ants that make trips fanning to and from as they search for food. Now, Argentinian ants, on the other hand, right, they're more of your nomads. They're constantly moving and they're establishing new networks. It's almost like when I think of other engagements I've supported in the construction industry, where it's all project-based. They're spinning up these networks at these site locations. 6 months later, those are being decommissioned and spun up over here, adapting to what other factors exist there. There's lessons to be learned from these guys. In fact, Argentinian ants have the largest scale out of anybody that we've discussed. They literally have the largest contiguous colony, stretches 3,700 miles, and it's in Europe. And they've been able to measure it because the ant at this one end of the colony and 3,700 miles away, they introduced it to another ant from that same, what they assumed was the same network, and they didn't get into a fight, right? Like they communicated, they recognized each other, there was an authentication, multi-factor process there, and they were authorized to continue. So it's just incredible stuff. One that I really enjoy is the Malaysian leafcutter ants, right? And these guys, they have central nests as well, but they've actually figured out how to optimize, and they actually ferment these leaves, and they grow fungal cultures off of those leaves, and that's the food that they eat, right? Now, when leafcutter ants are out there, there's different size leafcutter ants, right? And based on their genetic lottery, some of them get the huge heads, they're the big warrior ants, and the other ones are smaller. But hey, everybody's got a part to play, right? So as they move through the network, right, they're looking at path MTU discovery. They're trying to identify what's the largest MTU size I can bring into the nest based on me. You've got this one guy over here, he's like, man, I'm all about jumbo frames, don't fragment at all, right? So, it's just fascinating. These guys work together and they optimize to make sure that not only what they can bring in is able to be handled, but also the receiving ants on the other side of that are able to receive it. And then when we think about, again, just the different kind of workloads and things that they're doing, right? Everything from scouting and foraging to distribution, warehousing, environmental factors, right? They've studied these networks, and they realize the thermal convection that these ants have designed within their colonies, so that no matter what the temperature is outside, it's maintaining a constant climate-controlled temperature within. Some of that's even wind-induced. Waste management, right? If we, back to that previous diagram, you could see there was actually compartments and little rooms that they have all of their waste set up in. So there's no, obviously the disease and things that could come from waste if they were living within that. They even slope those actually downhill from the rest of the colony, so if they actually got water and flooding, they're not flooding any of that waste into it. It's just incredible design effort that goes into these, and again, a lot that we can learn. Some of the ants actually are in the shepherding business, right? They actually herd aphids. I don't know if any of you know this. I've witnessed it in my garden myself, where I've literally seen ants that are tending to their flocks of aphids, and right there, the aphids are deriving that sugary sap that the ants love, but then, they're providing the protection from the other things that love to eat aphids. So, they get it. They understand that in their network, they need to not only optimize production, but they also need to employ defense, right? Again, these guys deal with APTs just like the bees, just like us. And there's a whole host of things that eat ants. So I had to really distill this down into a few that I thought maybe provided value, right? So a couple interesting things here is the poison dart frogs. You may be familiar with these, right? Pretty cool little guys that live in the tropical rainforests, and they've got this neurotoxic alkaloid substance on their skin, right? Definitely affects us in dramatic ways. A lot of tribes use that on their arrow tips to cause damage. They actually derive all of that toxicity from the alkaloids from eating ants, right? So it's kind of this living off the land approach that the APT is using. Maybe even touching on a bit of crypto mining, where they're leveraging the resources from that ant to package in their own payload. And then the other one I thought was really fascinating, the assassin bug. It may be hard to see on the slide on the far right. That bug has actually covered its entire body in dead ants, right? And the whole idea here is it's evading detection. So what it will do is it will infiltrate its way into an ant colony, covering itself in the dead bodies of its victims, so that the other ants don't detect it and it's allowed to move freely and get in there. So again, network segmentation is never going to be perfect, right? We're going to have ways that the adversary evades our detection. But the whole idea here is to provide more barriers. The more that we have segmentation, the harder it is for that adversary to pivot and get to the more critical resources, right? A phrase that I've borrowed that I love from Dr. Chase Cunningham, Dr. Zero Trust, some of you may be familiar with him. He says, nobody wants to be the slowest gazelle on the Serengeti, right? And the idea is adversaries operate off of incentives just like we do, right? So if I have company A and company B pulled up on both of my screens and I'm trying to infiltrate and find out what way I can exploit them, if company A has network segmentation in place, has a really defensive posture, much harder for me to figure out and probe their network, enumerate, figure out what kind of resources I can get to. Company B, it's entirely flat, and I got everything converged. IT, IoT, OT is all leveraged on there. Cool, let me go attack this IoT thing so that I can gain access, and then I'll get into their critical servers, right? The whole idea is we've got to de-incentivize that. They're going to move on to that other gazelle on the Serengeti that isn't doing those practices. Same thing that we've identified with these use cases here. So that brings me to the final use case. Prairie dogs. By far my favorite. I will say my wife will probably be very happy after today because I have shared so many useless facts about prairie dogs, bees, and ants over the last few months as I've learned through this. But prairie dogs are absolutely amazing. They're a keystone species as well. There's several other species that rely on prairie dogs' existence just to exist themselves, the ways that they contribute back to the broader community and the impact. I think there's a correlation we can all gather there from how do we become a keystone SOC team, right? How do we become a keystone security team when we think of these ways that we drive back to the other parts of the business? Now, one fact that I did not know about prairie dogs prior to this in-depth study that I've done is that they literally have one of the most advanced and complex language systems on Earth. A lot of scientists claim even much more advanced than dolphins, some of our primate cousins, if you will. But the idea is these prairie dogs have an immense amount of ability to describe potential threats in detail and adapt behaviorally and alert the rest of the colony as things are happening. So for that, I give them the Global SOC Team Champ, and we'll get into some of the ways they alert and some of the aspects that they leverage this. Just to give you kind of some metrics as well, largest recorded prairie dog town covered 25,000 square miles right here in Texas, estimated about 400 million prairie dogs that lived in that community, right? And just insane numbers. Fortunately, the numbers of prairie dog populations have dwindled by about 85, 90% from their original numbers. But again, massive things. If you've ever seen the Ballad of Buster Scruggs and you hear in the beginning, he's like dog hole, right? I mean, there's a million entrances. There's typically when you look at a subset of a prairie dog town, they call it a coterie. And this is one that will encompass about an acre, right? So let's distill down from 25,000 square miles down to a single acre where we've got a coterie and a smaller unit, a smaller subset network, if you will, a small cell. Typically 50 to 60 entrance and exit points. It's a complex labyrinth of chambers, storage rooms, nursing rooms, sleeping, cafeteria, waste. Fantastic ventilation designs. They've got false entrances and false exits, right? So think of honeypots that we might be able to drop into our network that our adversaries will pursue. Allows us to get into a moment where we can contain, sandbox, triage, do our notion there. Prairie dogs do the same exact thing. Not a flat network, right? They've got immense network segmentation when we look at their dens. And it was very difficult to find any really complex diagrams on the World Wide Web, but best I could find kind of indicated some of this reality where they not only have ventilation ducts, they've got separate rooms for different purposes, workload segmentation, and then again, business continuity, disaster recovery. They've got flood mitigation and escape tunnels. So it's a wonderful design. Now, when we look at the animal language itself, when we actually look at the protocols that they're leveraging, prairie dogs essentially leverage a combination of yips, barks. They also do multi-factor and biometric authentication with hugs and kisses and smells with each other. So they're using a whole host of different protocols to not only drive authentication, but also communicate and leverage that. And in high detail, right? So they've actually been able to measure differences in prairie dogs making calls on a small dog that is walking towards the entrance of a burrow versus this is a large coyote, a brown dog that's running, right? Being able to literally describe in detail. When we look at some of the calls that they make, right, there's this jump yip is probably the most popular one that people identify and understand. Pretty funny little video. You guys might want to go down the YouTube rabbit hole later and look these up. I equate it to the gratuitous ARP, right? This essentially happens, they do this all day long, even tabletopping when there's not even threats there. They're literally, one of the prairie dogs will alert, send out that ARP, the rest of them will respond that they're there, that they're paying attention, and go on with their lives. But fantastic ways that they leverage that. Again, just down to security hygiene basics, right? They've got network segmentation in place where they're dividing by workload. They're also doing that down to the endpoint itself when we look at the actual pups of prairie dogs and the way that they divide the rooms for the birthing areas. And same thing when we also look at the way that they do multi-factor authentication. They're not just leveraging the calls and the yips, but they're also leveraging personalized sniffs and hugs when they encounter each other in the burrows. And they classify their different calls, so they have different alert mechanisms within the network to identify when there's a potential event indicator of compromise. So I look at it as, overall, it's a well-orchestrated SIM SOAR. They've reduced the attack surface, and they have the ability to pause workloads and restart those in a matter of seconds. Now, just like the other use cases we've discussed, these guys also faced advanced persistent threats. And reality is there's a ton of things that eat prairie dogs, but prairie dogs have a few things that are going for them, right? Just calling it out, right? Like they literally can produce 1 to 6 new prairie dogs per female per month. So when we look at this notion of 400 million prairie dogs in a single town, that's one way to battle against the threats that are trying to take them out. And it's really attrition, right? It's a war of attrition. There's not necessarily, unless we're looking at diseases themselves that can wipe out prairie dogs, and there's not necessarily a way that they could confederate and provide a battle against that unless they're ensuring that they're not breeding internally within the same families. They're basically going to have to fend off these larger predators. Now, a couple of the APTs do something pretty interesting. So, for instance, the black-footed ferrets actually live in the prairie dog towns. And even though they're a threat to the prairie dogs are considered a keystone species because they're actually providing the ecosystem that these ferrets can live in. And most of these, right, they're living off the land, right? They're enjoying the empty burrows. They wait there. And just like the adversary, they're going to wait till the security team is sleeping before they go and blue screen to death a prairie dog, right? And they go and they take one out. But security team's able to adapt to that. And again, they're able to have that growth and continue their process. So that I think covers the prairie dogs. Now, all of this, again, boils down to this central formula that we described earlier. And again, framing this around the concept that network segmentation will never be perfect, but if we can be adaptable, if we can scale, if we can attack the kill chain, right? And as we know, when adversaries compromise a device, what are they looking to do next? They're looking to enumerate the network, spread, get to things that they can get to, escalate privileges. If we can put hurdles in that just by creating a much more defensible architecture, we're in a position to have a much more optimized defense. We can then worry about optimizing what the network was there to do in the first place, intended as transport and a way and a path for our systems to communicate with our other systems and get to that bottom line where we have a positive goal outcome, where we've got surplus, where we have resiliency, and our network is going to live to another day. So that wraps up the discussion. If you guys want to connect, this is a QR code for my LinkedIn profile, but sincerely appreciate everybody listening and satisfying my curiosity for the animal kingdom here.